Harry S. Truman was sipping bourbon in the dim light of Speaker Sam Rayburn's private study when the phone split the room in half. Outside, Washington hummed with the routine pace of a nation still at war, but inside that small corner of the Capitol, the world was about to tilt. It was 5:25 p.m. on April 12, 1945, a date Truman would replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The voice on the other end belonged to Steve Early, President Roosevelt's press secretary. Normally calm and crisp, Early sounded strained, almost trembling. "Come to the White House immediately," he ordered. Then something strange. "Enter through the Pennsylvania Avenue main gate." That was never how a vice president was summoned. Truman asked what had happened. Early refused to say a single word more. By 5:30, Truman was inside the White House, rushed past staff who wouldn't meet his eyes. The silence in those hallways felt heavier than any briefing he had ever attended. He was guided upstairs to Eleanor Roosevelt's private study, where she rose slowly and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Her face carried a grief he couldn't yet understand. "Harry," she said softly, "the president is dead." 5 words. 5 words that shattered the most powerful office in the world. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had led America out of the Depression and across oceans of war, had died in Warm Springs, Georgia. A cerebral hemorrhage. Sudden. Final. Truman's first reaction was instinct, not politics. "Is there anything I can do for you?" he asked quietly. Eleanor Roosevelt's response cut through the room like a prophecy. "Is there anything we can do for you? You're the one in trouble now." Truman had been vice president for only 82 days. In that time, Roosevelt had kept him at the far edges of power. No access to major decisions, no war briefings, no insight into secret weapons or diplomatic gambles. Now, suddenly, Truman carried the weight of ending the deadliest conflict in human history, without the information he needed. But Truman had no idea that the real crisis wasn't Roosevelt's death. It was what Roosevelt had never told him. And the secrets waiting for him would shake the foundations of the world. The morning after Roosevelt's death, Truman walked into his first full cabinet meeting as president. The long wooden table, polished by years of Roosevelt's leadership, now felt hostile and foreign. Around it sat the men who had shaped American strategy through the Depression and World War II, veterans of a political world Truman had only glimpsed from the outside. Their faces were tense, unreadable. Truman immediately sensed the truth. They did not see him as their leader. They had spent more than a decade following Roosevelt's commands. They had planned invasions, forged alliances, and negotiated with dictators. Truman, on the other hand, had been chosen as vice president because he was safe, uncontroversial, and unlikely to challenge Roosevelt's inner circle. Now he was the commander-in-chief, and these men were acting as if he was still just visiting. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius began briefing Truman on international matters, but everything about his tone felt rehearsed, incomplete. He mentioned agreements with the Soviet Union but glossed over details. When Truman pressed him for specifics, Stettinius shifted uncomfortably, offering vague assurances that arrangements were in progress and diplomatic understandings had been maintained. Truman realized he was being spoken to like an outsider, by men who still viewed Roosevelt as the only president that mattered. Yet the worst moment came nearly 2 weeks later, when the quiet and formidable Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, requested a private meeting. Truman assumed it was about operations in Europe or the upcoming invasion of Japan. Instead, Stimson closed the door, sat opposite Truman, and calmly revealed a secret that felt like it belonged in science fiction. For 3 years, he said, the United States had been developing a weapon unlike anything in human history, an atomic bomb. It had consumed more than $2 billion, employed over 130,000 people, and built entire hidden cities in Tennessee and Washington state. Truman sat frozen. The project was nearly complete. A test was only months away, and Roosevelt had never told him any of it. Truman realized something terrifying. The U.S. government had been running colossal, world-shaping operations without the knowledge of the man who was now expected to lead them. If this was just one secret, how many more were buried under Roosevelt's shadow? But the atomic bomb was only the beginning. The next secrets Truman uncovered would reveal just how deeply Roosevelt's inner circle had kept him, and the entire nation, in the dark. The revelation of the atomic bomb left Truman shaken, but what disturbed him even more was the behavior of Roosevelt's senior officials in the days that followed. One meeting after another made it painfully clear that the late president's inner circle saw Truman not as a leader, but as an interruption. They had spent years shaping policy under FDR, and they weren't ready to hand that power over. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau was among the most forceful. He entered Truman's office with a binder of plans Roosevelt had approved for post-war Germany. Morgenthau expected Truman to sign them without debate, a policy that would have stripped Germany of industry and reduced it to a permanent agrarian state. But Truman hesitated. The world was changing rapidly. The war wasn't even over, and Morgenthau was treating him like a clerk, not the president. If Morgenthau was stubborn, Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Commerce, was openly confrontational. Wallace had served as Roosevelt's vice president before being replaced by Truman on the 1944 ticket. Wallace never hid his resentment. He believed he should have been the one standing in the Oval Office, and he carried that bitterness into every meeting. Wallace often challenged Truman's foreign policy in front of other officials, trying to steer conversations back toward Roosevelt-era idealism, especially the belief that Stalin could be reasoned with. Then there was Attorney General Francis Biddle, a brilliant but dismissive Roosevelt loyalist. During cabinet sessions, Biddle would lean back in his chair, arms folded, and answer Truman as though he were an inexperienced mayor instead of the President of the United States. He rarely used Truman's title, often preferring pointed remarks about continuing President Roosevelt's work. Truman recognized the condescension instantly. He had been underestimated most of his life. But the most dangerous figure was still Secretary of State Edward Stettintinius. He had accompanied Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference, where critical decisions about post-war Europe were made. When Truman asked for details, Stettintinius danced around questions, offering only fragments of information. The vagueness was deliberate. Men like Stettintinius believed the Roosevelt agreements were sacred political scripture, and that Truman had no right to question them. Truman could tolerate disrespect, but he could not tolerate secrecy. Every incomplete answer, every evasive briefing made him realize that he wasn't leading a team. He was inheriting a faction loyal to a president who no longer existed. And that faction had no intention of letting Truman reshape America's foreign policy. But Truman was about to learn the full truth about Yalta and what Roosevelt had promised Stalin behind closed doors. And once he saw it, there would be no going back. When the documents from the Yalta Conference finally reached Truman's desk, he cleared the room before opening them. For days, he'd sensed that Roosevelt's advisors were withholding something significant, but he had not expected the scale of what lay inside those folders. What he read felt less like a diplomatic agreement and more like the blueprint for a world being carved up without oversight. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had met in February 1945 to determine what the post-war map of Europe would look like. But Truman discovered that Roosevelt had made enormous concessions to Stalin, concessions that the Soviet leader had no intention of honoring. The first shock was Poland. Roosevelt had promised free and fair elections, but the fine print revealed that the future Polish government had to be friendly to the Soviet Union. Truman immediately understood what that meant. Stalin had been given permission to shape Poland's future. The documents showed that the Soviet interpretation was even harsher. Stalin didn't view friendly government as diplomacy. He viewed it as domination. The Red Army was already arresting Polish resistance fighters. Communist officials were being installed in key cities. Eastern Europe wasn't moving toward democracy. It was falling into Soviet control. Then Truman reached the section detailing the Far East. Roosevelt had offered the Soviets sweeping territorial rewards in exchange for joining the war against Japan. The Kuril Islands, the southern half of Sakhalin, and access to strategic Chinese ports. Lands that were not America's to give had been promised away. Truman paused, stunned that Roosevelt had agreed to redraw the map of Asia without consulting the Chinese government. The final revelation hit the hardest. Roosevelt had made no concrete plan for withdrawing Soviet troops from Eastern Europe. No deadlines. No enforcement mechanisms. Nothing. Stalin could stay indefinitely, and he did. What Truman held in his hands was the beginning of a new geopolitical struggle. One Roosevelt's staff insisted was harmless cooperation. Truman closed the file slowly. Now he understood why Stettinius had evaded questions. Why the cabinet treated Roosevelt's directives as sacred scripture. Why nobody wanted to give him details. These were agreements designed for a world that no longer existed, and honoring them blindly would give Stalin a free hand to control half the continent. But knowing the truth was only the first step. Truman still had to confront the men who wanted him to follow Roosevelt's path, even if it meant surrendering Europe to Stalin. As Truman absorbed the reality of Yalta, he began seeing Roosevelt's cabinet in an entirely different light. Their evasive answers weren't just habit, they were loyalty. Loyalty not to him, not to the Constitution, but to a dead president's worldview. Every meeting now felt like stepping into a room full of guardians protecting a legacy rather than serving a nation. Henry Morgenthau was the first to push back openly. He continued insisting that Truman embrace the Morgenthau Plan, which would have dismantled German industry permanently. Morgenthau argued that punishing Germany was the only path to future peace. Truman, who had seen the German people after the war's devastation, believed otherwise. But Morgenthau dismissed his doubts as inexperience, a mistake Truman would not forget. Henry Wallace took things further. Roosevelt's former vice president was convinced that Stalin's intentions were peaceful, and he wanted the U.S. to trust Soviet leadership completely. Wallace repeatedly challenged Truman in cabinet sessions, implying that Truman was too confrontational, too suspicious, too un-Roosevelt. His tone was not advice, it was accusation. Francis Biddle, the Attorney General, played a quieter but equally corrosive role. He acted as though Truman were a guest occupying Roosevelt's seat temporarily. Biddle's subtle smirks, slow sighs, and condescending explanations revealed a man who believed he was preserving a sacred political order. Truman recognized the pattern. Roosevelt had raised bureaucratic giants who now saw themselves as protectors of his legacy. But nothing compared to the obstruction from Secretary of State Stettinius. Every time Truman pressed him about Soviet commitments or European transitions, Stettinius responded with artful vagueness. He used diplomatic fog to mask uncomfortable truths. Ultimately, Truman realized that Stettinius feared the consequences of challenging Stalin more than he respected the authority of the new president. The breaking point came when Truman discovered that these men weren't just passive resistors. They were actively trying to maintain Roosevelt's policies in his absence. They were discussing plans, drafting memos, and coordinating foreign policy positions without consulting him. Some even hinted that Truman should simply stay the course until they could guide him more effectively. That was the moment Truman made his decision. If he did nothing, he would become a puppet of Roosevelt's legacy, overseeing policies he didn't agree with in a world that was already changing. The Soviet Union was tightening its grip on Eastern Europe. The atomic bomb was nearing completion. The maps of the future were shifting. Truman needed a team loyal to reality, not nostalgia. Next, Truman would do something no one expected. Challenge Roosevelt's entire inner circle and begin removing the men who had shaped American policy for over a decade. Truman's advisors warned him repeatedly. Firing Roosevelt's cabinet would be political suicide. Newspapers adored FDR's inner circle. Liberals treated them as architects of victory. Even foreign governments recognized their signatures on key wartime agreements. Replacing them would bring outrage, suspicion, and endless questions. But Truman saw no alternative. America needed a president, not a caretaker. The first to go was Edward Stettinius, the man who had carried Roosevelt's diplomatic secrets like sacred relics. Truman needed someone who could confront Stalin with a steady hand, not someone who softened every disagreement with polite ambiguity. In July 1945, he replaced Stettinius with James F. Burns, a seasoned statesman who wasn't intimidated by the Soviets or trapped by Roosevelt's promises. Burns had backbone and, more importantly, loyalty to Truman. Next came Henry Morgenthau. His rigid vision for Germany, turning a defeated nation into a ruined farmland, was dangerously outdated. Europe needed rebuilding, not revenge. Truman forced Morgenthau to resign and appointed Fred Vinson, a level-headed official who believed economic stability in Germany would be essential to post-war peace. Truman understood something Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary didn't. A starving Europe would only feed extremism. Francis Biddle's dismissal came soon after. The Attorney General's condescending attitude and obsession with preserving New Deal structures left no room for Truman's emerging foreign policy agenda. Biddle was replaced by Tom Clark, a sharp, pragmatic Texan who prioritized national security over ideological nostalgia. Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's former vice president, was the most dramatic removal. Wallace publicly criticized Truman in speeches, articles, and interviews, insisting that America should continue trusting Stalin. He implied Truman was sabotaging Roosevelt's dream of harmony with the Soviets. But Truman had seen the truth in the Yalta papers and in Stalin's actions across Europe. Wallace was removed in 1946 after defying Truman one time too many. By the end of 1946, nearly every major figure from Roosevelt's inner circle was gone. Truman had replaced them with people who understood the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. Not dreamers, not idealists, realists. The political backlash was fierce. Headlines questioned Truman's competence. Democrats whispered about replacing him before the 1948 election, and public approval plummeted. But Truman remained firm. He wasn't trying to destroy Roosevelt's legacy. He was trying to save the future. Only a new team could navigate the rising Soviet threat and the dawn of nuclear power. But Truman's biggest challenge wasn't firing Roosevelt's cabinet. It was proving to the world that his new hardline approach to Stalin was the only path that could save Europe from falling into darkness. With Roosevelt's cabinet gone, Truman finally had space to think clearly, and the picture he saw unfolding across Europe was terrifying. Reports from American diplomats showed a continent being swallowed piece by Soviet influence. In Poland, opposition leaders were disappearing. In Romania and Bulgaria, communist officials were rising to power under the protection of Soviet troops. Everywhere, Stalin was tightening his grip, ignoring every promise made at Yalta. Truman realized the United States couldn't rely on agreements, handshakes, or Roosevelt-era optimism. Stalin was exploiting every gap in Allied unity. America needed a response, not words but policy. His new Secretary of State, James Burns, shared the same conclusion. Burns briefed Truman daily, painting a brutally honest picture. Eastern Europe was being locked behind an iron curtain. If the U.S. didn't act, the Soviets would dominate the continent. But the most urgent warning came from Greece and Turkey. Both nations were on the brink of collapse, one from civil war, the other from Soviet pressure. British intelligence informed Truman that they could no longer support these countries. The British Empire was financially exhausted after years of war. If the U.S. didn't step in, Moscow would. That was the moment Truman understood. This wasn't simply about territory. It was about ideology, freedom versus authoritarianism, democracy versus Soviet control. If the United States didn't act decisively, half the world might fall under communist domination without a single shot being fired. America couldn't afford another Munich, another failure to confront aggression early. In early 1947, Truman addressed Congress with a message unlike anything America had heard before. He declared that the United States would support free nations resisting communist pressure. This was not an extension of Roosevelt's policies. It was a complete break from them. The Truman Doctrine was born. It would become the foundation of America's Cold War strategy for decades. Critics accused him of fearmongering. Roosevelt loyalists claimed Truman's new approach would provoke the Soviets unnecessarily. Henry Wallace publicly blasted the doctrine, calling it a betrayal of Roosevelt's vision. But Truman ignored the noise. He had seen the future Stalin was building, and he refused to let it expand unchecked. For the first time, Truman wasn't reacting to events, he was shaping them. America was no longer waiting for Stalin to break promises. It was preparing to stop him. But even Truman could not predict what would come next. The crisis that would bring the world's superpowers to the edge of starvation and force America into one of the greatest humanitarian missions in history. Europe in 1947 looked nothing like the triumphant posters of victory. The war had left cities hollowed, factories twisted into scrap, and millions struggling simply to survive. Truman received cables describing starvation-level shortages in France, Italy, Austria, and Germany. Winter threatened to kill more people than bombs had. In the chaos, communist parties, backed quietly by Moscow, were gaining ground. Economic desperation was becoming Stalin's most effective weapon. Truman's new Secretary of State, General George C. Marshall, toured the continent and returned home deeply shaken. He told Truman something brutally honest. Europe would collapse without massive American aid, and if it did, communism would sweep across the region uncontested. Marshall wasn't proposing a relief plan. He was proposing economic resuscitation on a scale the world had never attempted. In June 1947, Marshall unveiled his bold idea at Harvard University. The United States would help rebuild Europe, friend and former enemy alike. The plan was simple on its surface but revolutionary in its implications. America would invest billions to prevent famine, restore industry, and give nations the stability needed to resist Soviet pressure. Truman immediately saw its importance. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. Critics erupted. Some conservatives argued it was too expensive. Why should American money rebuild countries that had dragged us into war twice? They asked. Others believed the plan was provocative, claiming it would antagonize Stalin and spark new tensions. Roosevelt loyalists attacked it for abandoning FDR's hope of cooperation with Moscow. But Truman had no illusions left. The Soviets rejected the plan immediately and pressured Eastern European governments to do the same. Stalin didn't want prosperity, he wanted dependence. Truman pushed forward anyway. Congress hesitated, but after the communist coup in Czechoslovakia in early 1948, a stark reminder of Soviet ambition, the aid package passed. The Marshall Plan went into effect, delivering food, fuel, machinery, and financial aid across Western Europe. In less than 4 years, entire economies rebounded. Factories roared back to life. Infrastructure rose from rubble. Communist movements lost their appeal. For Truman, it was validation. Roosevelt's advisors had insisted cooperation with Stalin was the only path. But the Marshall Plan proved something different. Economic strength was the real shield against tyranny. But even as Europe rebuilt, one city remained trapped, Berlin. And soon Truman would face a crisis that risked igniting the first direct showdown of the Cold War. Berlin was the fault line where World War II's end bled into the Cold War's beginning. After Germany's defeat, the Allies divided the country into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. But the heart of the problem lay deep in Soviet territory. Berlin itself, split into the same 4 zones, but surrounded entirely by land controlled by Stalin. It was a city balanced on a knife's edge. By 1948, Stalin's patience with Western influence in Berlin had worn thin. To him, a thriving democratic city inside Soviet land was an intolerable symbol, a billboard advertising Western freedom to millions living under Soviet rule. So he made his move. On June 24th, the Soviets sealed every road, rail line, and canal leading into West Berlin. Electricity was cut. Supplies halted. 2.5 million people were suddenly trapped. The blockade was absolute. Stalin believed the Western Allies would have no choice but to abandon the city. After all, who would risk a war with the Soviet Union just to save a distant pocket of civilians? Most of Roosevelt's former advisors would have urged negotiation, compromise, even retreat. But Truman's new team understood what surrender would mean. If Berlin fell, all of Europe would see that the United States lacked the will to confront Soviet pressure. Truman refused to pull out. He would not give Stalin a victory without a fight, but he also wouldn't start a war. The only option was one no one had ever attempted: supply an entire city entirely by air. Food, coal, medicine, everything needed to keep millions alive would have to be flown in one cargo plane at a time. The Berlin airlift began in July 1948. At first, it looked impossible. Old C-47 transports rattled across narrow runways built for peacetime, not a lifeline to a besieged city. But soon, the operation grew into a breathtaking display of determination. Aircraft landed every 3 minutes, day and night. Pilots flew through snowstorms, fog, and Soviet intimidation attempts. Children lined the fences to watch the planes bring hope. By spring 1949, the impossible had become undeniable. The airlift was sustaining the entire city. The Soviets, humiliated, lifted the blockade. Truman had not only saved Berlin, he had shown the world that America would stand firm against Soviet aggression without firing a single shot. But Truman's transformation was still incomplete. To truly secure the free world, he would need to create an alliance unlike anything in history, and confront the critics who insisted he had betrayed Roosevelt's vision. The success of the Berlin airlift transformed Truman's presidency. What had begun as a desperate gamble became a symbol of American resolve. Yet even as the world praised his leadership, Roosevelt loyalists continued attacking him. They insisted Truman was destroying the collaborative spirit FDR cherished. They claimed Stalin only needed patience and trust. But every event since Yalta proved otherwise. Stalin respected power, not promises. Truman had understood this long before his critics did. With Europe rebuilding and Berlin saved, Truman made his boldest move yet, creating a permanent alliance to protect democracies from Soviet expansion. In 1949, at his urging, the United States and Western nations formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. For the first time in American history, the U.S. committed to defending other nations against aggression. Roosevelt's cabinet would have never dared take such a step. But Truman saw the future clearly. If free countries did not lock arms, they would fall one by one. Meanwhile, his critics continued to insist that Roosevelt's approach had been the wiser path. Henry Wallace argued that the Soviets were misunderstood. Others claimed Truman's policies were turning the world into an armed camp. Even Eleanor Roosevelt made subtle jabs, hinting that her husband would have handled Stalin differently. Truman listened, but he didn't bend. He had read the Yalta documents. He had watched Soviet tanks roll into eastern capitals. He knew trusting Stalin was not diplomacy, it was surrender. History moved quickly to vindicate him. The communist takeover of Eastern Europe, the coup in Czechoslovakia, the crushing of opposition in Poland, and the Soviet pressure in Turkey and Greece proved beyond doubt that Stalin had never intended cooperation. If Truman had kept Roosevelt's cabinet, the United States would have followed a path of appeasement, and the Soviet sphere might have stretched across all of Europe. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western economies. The Truman Doctrine shielded free nations from communist pressure. The Berlin airlift demonstrated American resolve. NATO created a collective defense that would ultimately win the Cold War. None of these achievements would have been possible under Roosevelt's old team, men who were too loyal to FDR's legacy to confront the world as it truly was. And this is why Truman fired them. Because leadership isn't about honoring the past. It's about facing the reality of the present. Roosevelt's advisors were rowing toward a vision that had died with him at Warm Springs. Truman needed people rowing toward a world defined by Soviet ambition, nuclear weapons, and fragile democracies fighting for survival. Harry Truman didn't inherit a peaceful world. He inherited a world on the edge of a new and dangerous era. By replacing Roosevelt's cabinet, he gave the United States the clarity, courage, and strategy it needed to meet that era head-on. Truman wasn't trying to erase Roosevelt. He was trying to save the world Roosevelt left behind, and history proved he was right.